If everybody could wear what was going on their shirts, we would all treat them differently. And really, so many people are walking around in this world with trauma and unhealed trauma and generational trauma. They might not even know why they carry such a big weight on their shoulders.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Thank you for joining me. This podcast is a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. I believe that sharing our stories is an important step to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week to provide a platform for victims and survivors to tell their story and for experts and professionals to offer insights and information to help us all in our healing path and provide an education on being trauma-informed in order to bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. If you or someone close to you has been through the difficult experience of being a victim or survivor, or if your responsibilities involve understanding, supporting, or helping individuals who have experienced the trauma of rape or sexual assault, I urge you to consider subscribing and tuning into this podcast regularly. It's essential to recognize that you are not alone in this journey. There is a community here that cares deeply about your well-being. My goal is to provide you with insights, resources, and a supportive space where empathy, compassion, and understanding thrive. Your experiences matter, and my commitment is to being there for all my listeners every step of the way. Thank you again for joining me. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm glad you're here, and I consider it an honor that you're part of my growing audience. Thank you for spreading the word about SAS. This is episode 71, and this week I have the distinct honor of introducing you to my remarkable guest, Tiffany Thomson, who just happens to be my wife's cousin. But that's not why I asked her to be a guest on my show. She's here because she's doing incredible work to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, and anyone who's suffered trauma at the hands of others. She has a relatively new conflict resolution coaching practice. She offers mediation, training, meditation, and speaking presentations. She is extremely qualified, educated, experienced, and best of all, down to earth and easy to talk to. Give a listen to this week's episode, and you'll hear exactly what I mean. Here's Tiffany. Tiffany Thomson, welcome to the show. It is an honor and privilege to have you here with me.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
For my audience to know how I know Tiffany, she is my wife's cousin. So I've known Tiffany for 25 years, and we've gotten to know each other on occasion, family reunions mostly here and there, but she moved away several years ago, and I haven't seen her for quite some time, but I noticed on Facebook that you have started a new little business because of your educational background and your experience called Creating Peaceful Solutions. So I thought, wow, that is perfect for someone to come on to the show that has that kind of background and knowledge and talk to us a little bit about what your experience is with trauma victims, how trauma works, and what you're doing to help victims move on to being survivors and thrivers. Again, welcome, Tiffany. Tell us about your background.
My bachelor's degree is in behavioral science. And so a lot of my post-bachelor's degree career was in child welfare and working a lot with children that have been in trauma situations. And going from there, I went to prevention a little bit of alternative education. And now I'm back in the mental health space, working and advocating mostly with children. I work a lot with youth and children. But, we've had some cases here in Tennessee that what we know of is that this is like fourth generation child abuse happening. And so it's all the family knows. That's just how they know how to raise children. And most of them, because of their trauma, have children really early before they've had a chance to really heal their trauma. And so that's what I've done a lot of, is working with youth and families that have generational trauma. I think in today's day and age, we almost need to be trauma conscious, no matter what your field is. I grew up in an age, even generations before me, there's a lot of punishment that happened in the school system. You know, you didn't do this, you got this punishment. You didn't do this, you got this punishment. And now we have so many children that have experienced trauma that that same punitive mindset isn't working on today's kids. And to come alongside those children and to really support them and strengthen them through and help them to heal. I love that your focus is on the healing and the surviving and not just staying in the victim mentality. That's one shift society really needs to take right now, is like, once a victim, always a victim. I really struggle with that because I think we're all meant to thrive and survive. So I really like to focus on healing in a lot of the work that I do and how do we move forward. That's kind of what my background, my experience has been. And so I've been especially trained to work with domestic violence victims when it comes to mediation. In the state of Tennessee, every divorce case has to be mediated, and mediation usually brings the parties together. And as you can imagine, bringing parties together in a domestic violence situation isn't always the most helpful thing. So,
absolutely.
So a lot of what I do is really teaching people how to function in a trauma world, working with even businesses that have employees that have been through trauma. The old punitive way that we used to run businesses doesn't really work anymore. And so instead of people reacting positively to being punished or whatever and changing their behavior, they shut down more, they're less productive, and the workplace isn't a good, warm place for them to be. It's more a place where they get more trauma. So that's basically what I get to do.
Tell us, if you would, about your experience with trauma victims and moving them past victimhood into survivorship.
I think one of the things that you kind of touched on when you were just talking about sexual assault victims is that you never know when you're working with somebody who's been a victim of sexual assault because we don't talk about it enough. I can't tell you how many people that through my service in the community, service in my church, I've known people for years and they'll finally open up about sexual assault. And so I think as we're working with trauma-informed way in our communities, we need to be aware that people are carrying a lot more trauma than they are willing to even let us know about.
With your experience working with domestic violence couples, the type of situations that you deal with doesn't always involve domestic violence in a divorce situation, but oftentimes does. And then those domestic violence situations oftentimes, and I think a lot more than people realize, I think the prevalence of what I'm about to say is a lot higher than most people are aware of, and that is that the rate of sexual assault or rape within marital situations, domestic violence situations, is much, much higher than most people realize. I think statistically the rate is about 75% of domestic violence cases involve sexual assault and rape. My anecdotal personal experience from when I was a detective, it's probably closer to 100%.
Really?
I mean, it's almost impossible to have domestic violence, assaults, and violent situations without having rape and sexual assault. And you're right. It's the whole issue of getting victims of that crime to open up about that. It's not something that they immediately discuss because it's shameful and hard to talk about.
Sometimes victims of rape don't even know they are. Right. Because like they think, oh, as a wife, I was supposed to let him do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Or I remember having a conversation with a friend once who told me about the time she lost her virginity. And she told me that it was a friend of hers that said, well, I'm going to kill myself if you don't sleep with me. And I looked at her and I said, you know, you were raped, right? And she's like, no, because I let him do it. I said, no, you were raped.
Yeah,
you were emotionally coerced to sleep with him.
Absolutely.
She had no idea. And it had been 15 years since it had happened.
Right.
And then, you know, and so she had no idea.
And I have many experiences of that from survivors on my show who have been through very similar situations. The manipulation, the threats, the coercion, it's all part of rape. I think most people think rape is that masked man behind the bush as you're out jogging or walking
the dark alleyway.
The dark alley, yeah. And it's just not the situation. Most perpetrators are someone that the victim knows and has some sort of a relationship with. That's in over 75% of rape and sexual assault cases.
Well, and I think that's also why we have such a high rate of people not believing them. Oh, well, John would never do that. He's such a nice guy. because there's somebody they know, there's somebody their friends know, when they open up about it, you get so many people that don't want to believe that about John. He's so amazing,
Yeah. Well, and then you add the marital situation on top of that, as you just mentioned, it gets even worse. Tiffany, if you could tell us about your journey of becoming trauma-informed and actually what it means to you to be trauma-informed.
When I was in college doing my undergraduate degree in the early 2000s, that wasn't really the vocabulary that they used. Trauma-informed wasn't something we really studied. We studied a lot of, this is just the psychological disorder. Just almost like these things just happened from nowhere. Well, they're just this or they're just that. And it's just like, they got a cold type of a thing. It wasn't really the way we talked back then. So a lot of my trauma-informed education really came from being hands-on. Right out of college, I started working with families that have many generations of child abuse. I remember I never thought I'd be able to do that kind of work, but as some of us know, when you first get out of college, you take the first job that comes your way, trying to find something to support yourself. And so I started working in child welfare and found I had a love for it. And I remember people asking me, well, how can you work with these parents? Because my first job was really working with reunifying families, family where the children have been removed from the home, but trying to get the children back home with their parents. And like, how do you work with parents that have abused or neglected their kids? And I just said, well, I got to know them and found out that they had been abused and neglected, and knowing to really teach them a better way and believe that they can do things differently and they can heal from their trauma and raise their children in a more positive way and environment was really kind of my first hands-on training to trauma and healing and surviving and thriving and watching. Not every family was able to do it, and so it really got me a lot to learn and kind of go down a huge rabbit hole of resilience. How come I would have kids from the same family where one would thrive and one was in jail? How come sometimes it was different, really looking into resilience and how do we build resilience in children so that they're not perpetuating the child abuse cycle. Right. And so that's kind of where my introduction to it came. I have been trained as an advocate and a mediator. I've worked in the court system and I've done a lot that way, but I've just really seen that really we walk around never knowing people's whole story. You hear it all the time, if everybody could wear what was going on their shirts, we would all treat them differently. And really so many people are walking around in this world with trauma and unhealed trauma and generational trauma. They might not even know why they carry such a big weight on their shoulders.
Yeah. In fact, I just had an interview with a guest, but he said that very thing. I didn't know where my trauma came from. And he grew up with a very abusive father who said things that were very harmful to him and abusive and assaultive. And then later he was raped by someone he thought he could trust. And that whole concept of not knowing what it is that you're even experiencing, whether it be emotional trauma or physical trauma or sexual trauma, and then trying to deal with the after effects. Bessel van der Kolk wrote his book, The Body Keeps the Score. And a lot of times the body does things to us. We have these physical and emotional reactions to things that we don't even remember where the source is. That's all part of that survival trauma-informed process of learning about what the brain does versus what your mind does and how your body responds to all of that, and then giving yourself that permission to accept it and heal from that. That's a hard journey, hard path, especially like you said, if you're not aware of what it is that you're suffering from. You know that it hurt, but sometimes you don't know how to label it.
Right. Or it seems so normal to you because it's what's happened for many generations. I just advocated for a case where the mom, she had a lower IQ, never really, finished school, really struggled. And in order to get anything that she needed, she would just sleep with people. So if she needed a ride to the grocery store, she would sleep with somebody so that they would take her to the grocery store. And that was so normal in her world. Just be the same as like me paying an Uber to go to the grocery store. That was just her currency. To see how that affected what she was willing to do with her children and then their trauma, it's really difficult. to go in and to be able to educate people that this is not okay, and it's not okay that people are treating you this way, and to be able to advocate for themselves and stand up for themselves and get themselves in a better situation. Sometimes it's a many generational process. It doesn't always happen with the mom. You're hoping it happens with the kids.
Wow. That is a really difficult situation because, like you said, just telling them that that's not appropriate. That's not something that's good for you or your children probably goes in one ear and out the other because their lifestyle is built on that. And to change a lifestyle doesn't happen with you just saying 3 or 4 sentences or even spending weeks with them in therapy. I know that from having 4 adopted children. I mean, you can take a child out of an abusive situation and surround them with love and care and concern and good teaching. That doesn't mean that's going to grab hold of their inner being. No, it's not a fix necessarily.
No, they have to decide themselves. I have a really good friend she was trafficked. Her mom was trafficked. Her mom was trafficked. And it's just it was the same kind of situation. It was, hey, if we needed food, we knew exactly how to go get food for our family. I was actually really good friends with her daughter. So my friend, we'll call her Jane. She stopped the trafficking cycle, and I was really good friends with Jane's daughter. But I also was friends with Jane. She just said, it's just what we were taught to do. We were hungry, and we would just go take care of it, and we didn't need to depend on anybody else. But she wasn't going to pass it on to her daughter. She was going to change the story for her. And it was Jane deciding that she was changing that story that helped my friend to never have to experience that particular drama. Now, like you said, the generational trauma, she still had a lot of things she had to work through. She had to decide that she wasn't going to continue that lifestyle.
Yeah. That is something that I think is much more common in our society than most people realize or are willing to admit. And that's another problem, is just getting people educated on how pervasive not only child abuse, but child sexual assault, trafficking, and sexual assault in general, how pervasive that is in our society.
It really is.
It goes back to what I've mentioned many times. I'd kind of like to get your take on this. I believe that we live in a rape culture. And by that, I mean our culture is so tolerant and, for lack of a better term, uneducated or ignorant about sexual assault and rape and the impacts that it's having on our society, that instead of standing up against it and advocating for victims and survivors, people are just turning a blind eye, ignoring the situation. Judges are saying things like, well, I don't want to ruin this perpetrator's life by putting him in prison forever. So they give him a slap on the wrist and put him right back out into society. What is your take on how that impacts families and the people that you're dealing with in your business and your counseling?
That's a really good question. I think part of it goes back to what we said before. I think we're all against rape when we think about it being the alley guy jumping you, right? I don't think there's very many people in this world who are like, no, that's totally fine for people to go around and do that. But when we start talking about, oh, no, it can be a boyfriend that coerces you. It can be, the guilt trip or the shame or the blame or all that stuff. A lot of us are like, oh, that's just part of life, right? So that's where I really think you're talking about the rape culture.
Absolutely.
Like, oh, that's just part of life. And I can see, too, the judge being like, well, we don't want to, especially with a young kid, or, somebody whose prefrontal cortex is not developed fully. We don't have a really good system to rehabilitate sex offenders. That really hasn't really been a proven way. And we also can't lock up sex offenders forever and ever and ever. So what do we do? Instead of focusing on, okay, how can we improve treatment for sex offenders? How can we rehabilitate sex offenders and help them walk out with enough pride and confidence in themselves that they don't want to ever go back to that life? We don't have that answer. And I think that's where we really get into this two-sided problem, because it is a problem, especially if a kid, they made a stupid choice and we don't want them to be in prison for the rest of their lives. I don't know.
The problem is that oftentimes those kids who don't get the treatment that you're mentioning that they need maybe do spend a month or 2 in jail or get put on the sex offender registry. But if they're not rehabilitated, if their whole thought process and their mental attitude towards rape and sexual assault isn't changed, they're going to become repeat offenders. And that is where a lot of this problem persists, especially in the rape culture mentality. And we hear it in rap music. We hear it in the whole concept of the court system. We hear it in just the general conversations that you were mentioning, where people talk among themselves and say, well, it's okay because it was her boyfriend or it was her husband. What did she expect? That's part of what she's supposed to do. And it really causes problems in our society.
We think that putting people in jail is the problem. I'm not saying people shouldn't have punishment or whatever, but it doesn't solve the brain wiring that caused them to get into that situation in the first place. When we teach boys or girls or anybody to objectify another human being in any way and not treat that human being with dignity, we get into, well, what feels good to me right now? So I want to have sex with her. That would feel good. So I'm going to do whatever I have to do to convince her that that's what we should be doing right now, right? And they objectify her. They don't treat her with dignity. She is just a means to an end. So putting somebody in jail doesn't solve that problem. I'm not saying there shouldn't be punishment. I'm just saying it doesn't solve the problem. They haven't learned to treat people with dignity and respect. They haven't learned to not objectify other human beings. In fact, it probably only increases in jail because they are treated as objects. And that's probably where they got into the situation in the first place, right? They were treated as objects as a child that was maybe annoying their parents, or they were probably raped themselves, or they were somebody's mean to gratification. And so that, and then like you said, in those rap music, again, from what I've heard, it's a lot of treating women like they're objects, not like, oh, she's an amazing person. She does so much for her community. It's her boobs look like this and her butt looks like this. And so therefore she is an object. And then the pervasiveness of pornography and how boys get phones as early as 7 years old and they can have it in their pocket whenever they want it. I shouldn't say boys because I know a lot of girls who have struggled with pornography also, and they can see, and the people literally become objects on a screen. They don't see their face. They don't see their problems. They don't see their life. They don't see anything. And so they learn to objectify other human beings as a means to gratification.
And there's like a billion different directions we could go with this, but mostly I want to focus, Tiffany, on the things that you're doing in your Creating Peaceful Solutions practice. I know it's new. You just said you just started this, several months ago?
Yep. So right now, one of the things that has actually taken off the most is teaching people about conflict. And a lot of the people who have the budget to have me come in and train about conflict are businesses. I always try to put in a layer of being trauma informed because I watched this happen. My son's first job is a bunch of teenagers, and the person running the business was very punitive, would criticize them and punish them. A bunch of teenagers, and it didn't work. It absolutely did not work because these kids, they're different than the kids that, were raised in the 80s. They don't respond well to that kind of stuff. And so really going in and teaching the brain, I'm kind of a neuroscience nerd. I love all the stuff about the wiring of your brain and all that stuff. And so going in and teaching, are you dealing with people that are working from the reactive side of the brain? Or are they thinking? Are they engaged? And trying to teach people how to respond to individuals depending on what they're going through. So are they in crisis? Are they in fight or flight? How can we pull them into our peace and our calm if they're in a stormy situation? One of the conflict inventories I use is called the Craybill Conflict Inventory, and it talks about being in a calm and being in a storm. Those of us who know more about neuroscience, prefrontal cortex, different parts of your brain, but basically we operate differently when we're in the calm or when we're in the storm. I teach a lot about being in our calm so that we can bring people into our calm instead of going into their storm with them. I think that really has a lot to do with how we interact with people that are in trauma. As a social worker, most people I work with are stuck in their fight or flight or freeze. Most of them are freezing, not knowing how to move forward in their lives. Even if they're given the right tools, they're kind of just holding the tools and going, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to get housing. I don't know how to get food benefits. Even if you say, do it, here's the website, they're like, I don't know, because they're frozen. They're frozen in their trauma. So that's what I do a lot when I'm working with businesses, is teaching them about that. A lot of them don't understand what it's like when they're hiring minimum wage employees. A lot of times when you're hiring minimum wage employees, you're hiring people who have lived more in a trauma response their whole entire lives. They haven't been able to complete their education. They haven't been able to have the connections to get the right jobs. So it really is a lot of learning how to deal with people in trauma response. Knowing how you're reacting may only increase their trauma response, or if you learn ways to interact with people that helps them to calm and think with the right part of their brain, then you're going to have better results.
Yeah. I really relate to what you're talking about in terms of those people who are traumatized and are stuck in their trauma. So they've got the tools right in front of them, but they don't know what to do with them. And even if you show them what to do with them, their trauma, their brain is in such a dissociative state that they can't even hear the words that are coming through. They hear them, but they don't know how to process them. So you're right, getting them out of that trauma mentality, that dissociative mental state, and into a more calm, peaceful place, peaceful solution, helps them hear the situation better. And I think that's what most of the people that I try and teach lack, is that understanding that you have got to get somebody calm and in a peaceful place and in a safe space before they'll even respond to anything you say. If you're a cop or an advocate, a social worker dealing with somebody in that mental state, and you don't know the intricacies of trauma and how the brain is functioning and how the mind relates to what the brain is doing, you're not going to be able to make forward progress with that person. I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head with where we need to go with being trauma informed.
Well, and especially when you're talking about police officers, and they can misinterpret people's behavior and responses as a threatening way when maybe they weren't meaning to be threatening. In fact, several classes I took in my master's program were taught by an NYPD hostage negotiator. And he kind of changed after seeing so many things as a hostage negotiator and learning about the brain and the neuroscience behind all of that. You know, he transitioned into education, to teaching other people about this. And so his name's Jeff Thomson. He does fascinating work, mostly teaching people about how to build a relationship with people so that they can trust you, and then get them into a resilient frame of mind, because that's what we're trying to do. All of us experience some kind of trauma. All of us have something that doesn't go quite right for us. But when we increase our skills of resilience, then we can become that calm and we can help bring people into our calm. And so I do a lot of that in my training too. Also, I mean, I have a whole training I can do on just resilience itself and how to build resilience in ourselves. Every training I do, I try to put little tools of resilience so that we can become more resilient ourselves and teach resilience to others, so that no matter what happens, we can become thrivers and survivors.
Yeah. I love that, especially with my background in law enforcement. It really hits home for what I'm trying to do in terms of getting the message out to be trauma informed, and how important that is on so many levels. You've really pinpointed some of those different aspects of why it's so important to be trauma informed. I love that you're actually going into businesses, because I alluded to this and talked a little bit about it earlier, that whole concept of someone being in an abusive relationship at home. They're not going to walk into work and just build an instant wall and leave that behind and just concentrate on work. They're bringing their home life into their work situation. I'm wondering if you can help us understand what it is that you specifically teach to employers, to owners, and maybe CEOs or boards, what it is that you're trying to get across to them in how to deal with employees that may be in trauma.
I teach something I kind of developed called the peace pyramid. It's like the food pyramid, what we need to focus on most, and then kind of goes up a little bit from there. I teach that, throwing in a lot of my training and experience with trauma and why it's important to have these skills. But the first one on the bottom of the pyramid is resilience. As a business owner in my community, if I'm not resilient myself, then I'm usually causing more trauma than healing trauma, right? If I'm in a resilient place and I'm thriving and doing well, then I inspire others. And so because of my line of work, it's been hard for me to allow myself to feel joy sometimes. I can be in the most beautiful, wonderful, happy situation, but in the back of my mind, it's all the people who are hungry, all the people who are sleeping out on the streets in the cold, and so I don't allow myself to feel joy. I'm really learning to lean into my joy. I spread joy. When I shut my joy off and the good things that are going on in my life, then it doesn't exist and it cannot influence other people. And so that's the first thing I teach, is like lean into your joy. We teach breathing techniques, we teach gratitude, we teach all those things that really help build a resilient base. The next step in the peace pyramid is how to have a conversation with somebody without your own agenda. Sometimes when you're having a conversation with an employee or with somebody else, you're bringing them to your office because they're not performing how you would like them to perform. And if you start in there listening to find fault, If you have a conversation with them trying to teach them how wrong they are, then you do not get the information you really need. And so that's the next step, is to how to ask curious questions without an agenda. That might be where you find out that somebody was a victim of rape, sexual assault, domestic violence. Maybe it's just a financial stress that they found out the roof needs to be replaced and they have no idea how they're going to deal with that. Most of us are kind of going through something. So being able to really find out what it is that people are worried about or struggling with, that's the next one. The next stage up in that is being an active listener. How do we listen appropriately? And that goes a lot with asking the right questions, being curious. And then it's communicating our expectations. A lot of times when we communicate, we are not very clear. We don't want to offend anybody, especially here in the South. I love living in the South, but there's a lot of miscommunication because nobody wants to offend anybody. Everybody wants everybody to be happy, but nobody's happy because we've just skimmed along the surface and not had that real conversation.
Yeah.
And then the next one is lowering our expectations, because a lot of times we have expectations for other people that aren't their expectations. And so to lower those. And then I always say the tip of the pyramid is just to remember to let things roll off our backs. That not everything has to become a big deal. Sometimes we just need to let things go and love people instead of worrying too much about it. So that's something that, this whole kind of pyramid thing, and each one of those levels could be like their own training in and of themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. You could spend hours and hours on each one of those.
Yeah.
I love that model. And I know there are people in my audience that aren't just sex assault victims and survivors and victim advocates and cops. There's business owners that listen to this because they know that either they themselves have experienced rape or sexual assault or some sort of trauma. They're getting an education out of this, but they're business owners too. And so I know that there are those in my audience who are going to hear this and say, how do I get your information, your education, your creating peaceful solutions concepts into my business? Tell me, are you able to work with businesses all over the country, all over the world, because of Zoom and because of Google Meet and things like that, where you can have online meetings and trainings?
Absolutely. I'm also willing to travel if needed. But yeah, I have Zoom, happy to talk to people on the phone, do whatever. But I love training. I love going in and meeting people and hearing from them. A lot of times when I do training, I just take in my toolbox and we kind of build something together. What specifically is going to be the best tools for you to use in your particular business or situation. I just recently met with a bunch of marketers and they work specifically with small businesses. So I educated them on most of the people that you're dealing with have a dream that currently they're in fight or flight about. Because even though they're excited about making their dream a reality, they're scared that it's not going to become a reality, or they're sinking their whole life savings into a hope and a dream. And so they're probably in fight or flight. And so being able to tailor this to their specific audience. So that's what I like to do. But yeah, anybody who would like to talk with me and consult and see what maybe their needs are when it comes to creating peaceful solutions in whatever field you're in, whether it's business or social services or even education. I think it's huge for educators to know how to work with students that are struggling, or how to have better tools to make sure that they're resilient and that they're thriving. I'm happy to do it.
Tiffany, tell everyone what your website address is and how people could get a hold of you if they want to.
Okay. So my website hopefully will be up and running in a week. I'm not tech savvy, and that's something I've learned. And so I kind of had to break down and finally ask somebody to help me with it. So hopefully that'll be up and running in a week. But my email is tiffany@createpeacefulsolutions.com, or you can even give me a call or a text. My work number is 615-863-3101. So again, that's 615-863-3101. And you can call me or text me at that number, or you can email me at tiffany@createpeacefulsolutions.com, or get a hold of Dave. He can get you in touch with me.
Absolutely.
Find me on Facebook, or I actually have an Instagram too, which I'm just getting up and running, but it's just Create Peaceful Solutions, create_peaceful_solutions.
And I'm going to post that information in my episode notes. So if you didn't catch it listening, if you're driving, if you can't write this down right now, just go look at the episode notes and it'll all be there.
There you go.
That's true. This has been amazing. I have just really enjoyed my time with you. I so appreciate your willingness to be on the show and to share your educational background and your experiences in your work and what it is that you're doing with creating peaceful solutions. It's amazing, and I appreciate you, and I know my listeners will too. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. You're easy to talk to and bring out all the good things and the important things. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It just kind of flew by. I'd love to have you back sometime. I'd love to have you fill us in on another episode of how things are going, how your business is growing and thriving, because I know it will, but also telling your stories and helping other people cope and be resilient and grow and thrive and survive in their healing journey is such an important aspect of this show. So having you back would be a pleasure and an honor.
Anytime. Just let me know. I'd be happy to.
Well, thank you, Tiffany. We'll talk again.
All right. Thanks, Dave.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to extend a huge shout out to my guest, Tiffany Thomson, for bringing some great insights, thoughts, ideas, and support to my SAS listeners. It was fantastic having you with me, Tiffany, and I appreciate all you're doing to help and support victims and survivors of trauma. I also want to thank each of you, my listeners, for tuning in. I appreciate your loyalty and support. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts about this podcast and the ways it has helped you on your healing journey, or if it has helped you learn more about what it means to be trauma-informed, or if you would just like to comment about the show in general. If you haven't already, I would love to have you as a subscriber, and if you would just take a second to rate the show, I would appreciate that too. Please tune in again next week as I bring you another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. In the meantime, don't forget to do your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. The easiest way to do this is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.